Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about the urinary system. We're going to cover the anatomy first, and then we'll get into the physiology of the urinary system. So, the functions of the kidney are to regulate the blood. So, they regulate the plasma ion composition, they regulate the plasma volume, the osmolarity or the particle concentration of the plasma, and what should that be? So, if you're thinking of particle concentration or percent of red blood cells and percent of plasma, that should be 0.9% good. And that's around 300, 310 milliosmoles. Regulate plasma pH. What's the pH of the plasma? Good, 7.35, 7.45. And the goal of the kidneys are to remove metabolic waste products and foreign substances from plasma. So when you think of homeostasis of the body, one of the main organs that regulates plasma is going to be the kidneys. Um, the kidneys, in conjunction with the lungs, regulate CO2 levels, regulate ion concentration of the plasma, and maintain homeostasis in the body. The kidneys need hormones um, to help maintain homeostasis of the plasma and blood pressure. And the main regulatory mechanism for blood pressure is going to be the kidneys, right? So you're going to dump water out if blood pressure is too high into the urine, and you're going to hold on to water when blood pressure is low. Um, so we'll get into the functions of the kidney, into the physiology, but I want you to spend some time on the kidney physiology because it's really important. That's really critical care for patients. Um, if we think about the whole urinary system, the urinary system is to regulate uh, plasma, right, and remove wastes and foreign substances from your plasma. Um, and then the rest of the urinary system, besides the kidneys, like the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra, is to take the waste out, right? Some other functions of the kidney. The kidney secretes erythropoietin. We talked about that when we talked about blood. What does erythropoietin do? Okay, so erythropoietin is released when oxygen levels are low, right? So the kidney acts as a sensor and releases erythropoietin when oxygen levels are low. And that is going to ultimately do what? Increase red blood cell production. Good. Another function of the kidney secretes renin. And so we'll get into this when we talk about renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. It activates vitamin D3 to calcitrol for calcium uptake from the GI tract. It also will pull in calcium or reabsorb calcium from the urine back into the bloodstream. And then gluconeogenesis. It can make glucose from proteins, uh, protein precursors. So the macroscopic anatomy, macroscopic is what we can actually see. It's not microscopic, right? So we have two kidneys. Their job is to filter the blood, reabsorb nutrients, and secrete wastes. Then the ureters convey the urine to the bladder. The urinary bladder, and keep in mind there are other bladder areas, so you need to be specific. It's a urinary bladder, is going to collect and store urine. Notice that there's no reabsorption of fluid at the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is just a holding tank, and then there's one urethra, and that is going to convey the urine out of the body. The kidneys are retroperitoneally located, so they are in the back, um, and they're actually just just above your ribs. And so I'll show you a better picture. But here are your kidneys. Notice your left kidney is a little bit higher than your right kidney. Then you have these really long ureters. The ureters are actually smacked sort of up against the backbone, your vertebrae, for protection. And then the urinary bladder sits really low, and then your urethra. Your kidneys are red-brown. They're bean-shaped. They have a fibrous capsule surrounding them. They're retroperitoneally located, and they're surrounded by adipose tissue. So here's a better picture. Here are your kidneys, right? And actually, let me change the color of this. see, we'll do green. Okay, so if you take a look, the kidneys are located just below the liver and they're back deep in the body. So they're located around by the vertebrae. What do you have above that? You have your adrenal gland above the kidneys, right? And so if you follow this, here's your abdominal aorta and the red artery, right? And then that becomes your renal artery and that goes to the kidneys. And then you have the renal vein coming back and that merges with the vena cava. Take a look at the ureters. So the ureters are all the way down, they go all the way down, and the urinary bladder actually sits in your os coxae. So it's right, your pubic symphysis, if you could feel your hip bone, your pubic symphysis is right there. Urinary bladder is right behind that. If you take a cross section, or if you look at the cross section, here's your anterior view, here's your posterior view, here's your vertebrae. Take a look at the kidneys. Okay, the kidneys are right alongside the vertebrae on either side. And if you look in front of that, you have the liver and parts of your digestive tract. I know it's hard to see, but if you take a look too, look off to the right-hand side. So you have the body wall, right? And then you have the parietal peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum is this blue line. And notice that that's the peritoneal cavity. Notice how the kidneys are behind that cavity. So they're retroperitoneal, behind that peritoneum. And so they're separate. They're in their own separate little area. Okay, here is a kidney dissected. So if we were in lab, we would take a look at the kidney and then we would actually dissect it and look at the gross anatomy or the macroscopic anatomy. Okay, so the capsule is the fibrous connective tissue capsule that surrounds it. The adrenal gland sits above the kidney and the adrenal gland has a fibrous capsule as well. The outermost region is called the cortex. So you have the cortex of your kidney, right? And so this is your cortex region. And then more deep is the medulla region, okay? And so this whole region, even though it looks like it's outlining this, it's actually this whole region. So this is all the medulla, okay? Cortex is more superficial, medulla is more deep. You have your renal pyramids. So let me see if I can find it labeled. Here you go. So renal pyramid is right here. So this is a renal pyramid. This is a region where you have a lot of drainage of the urine, and I'll show you these white, do you see these white sort of lines? These are actually collecting ducts. And so these white lines are going to drain the urine from this region, from the cortex and the medulla into this region. And so the renal papillae is sort of the ending of the pyramids. And then you have these regions called, it's actually called the minor calyx. So if you look down at the picture towards your bottom right, the minor calyx is right here. These are all minor calyces. Calyx means cup, right? And then the major calyces are the bigger cups, okay? And then we end up with the renal pelvis region, which is right here. And then that leads into the ureter. So urine takes the path of going from the nephron, which we haven't talked about yet, through the pyramid into the papillary region, into the minor calyx, major calyx, and then the renal pelvis, right? And so I want you guys to know the pathway that urine takes to get out of the kidney. And so the job of the kidney, notice how, if you think of this as a clock, the 3 o'clock region has your renal artery. So the renal artery, notice the tributaries branch off, and each one is going to go to a pyramid. So this renal artery branches off, and I'll show you the arteries in a second, but it goes up and over, and then it ends in a capillary bed, or in many capillary beds, and then the veins go back out, right? And so it's kind of arced around the pyramids. And so the goal of the kidney is actually to filter out the blood. So what ends up happening is blood comes through here, the wastes get filtered out and drain into the urine and get dumped out of the body. And then the nutrients get reabsorbed and pulled back in. And then they go back into normal circulation from that renal vein. Okay, then the ureter. So the ureter is going to take the urine into the urinary bladder. And the urinary bladder is going to be that holding tank that stretches and fills with urine and then is excreted out of the body via the urethra. So here's a little bit more of the microscopic anatomy. So the nephron is the smallest functional unit of the kidney, or it's the filtration unit of the kidney. So for physiology, we like to talk about what the nephron does and how that nephron functions. Okay, so here is an artery, and it's going to go to the nephron, and this is actually a capillary bed, and then it leaves the nephron. Okay, or excuse me, the glomerulus. So this capillary bed is called the glomerulus, and then you have the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, because distal is further away, and then the collecting duct. And notice how the collecting duct is shared by many nephrons. So there'd be a nephron right here, a nephron right there, a nephron right there. Notice how this is called a cortical nephron. So cortical nephron, that loop of Henle doesn't go very deep into the medulla. So here's the medulla region, here's a cortex. If we're talking about juxtamedullary nephron, the loop of Henle goes really deep into the medulla. And so when you see a loop going really deep into the medulla, that is going to tell you that you're going to pull out a lot more water. Okay, so for example, like kangaroo rats, like desert rats, and your camels have really long loops of Henle, and they excrete out very minimal urine because they need to pull in that water and hold on to it. Okay, so here is the the collecting duct right there, and then it's going to drain into the minor calyx. So here's your papillary duct, here's your papillary region, and then your minor calyx, just sort of to orientate yourself. So the main point of this is your nephron, which includes the glomerulus, your proximal convoluted tubule, your loop of Henle, your distal convoluted tubule, is the smallest functional unit, or the smallest filtration unit of the body. We can skip this. So your ureters are hollow tubes. They're about 25 centimeters in length. So they are long. They extend from the kidney to the urinary bladder. They are retroperitoneally located as well, so behind the other body cavity. They have muscular walls that undergo peristalsis, a lot like your digestive system, to help move bladder through there. And then they have little flaps of mucosa at the bladder so that you don't get back up into the ureters. So take a look at the ureters. On the right kidney, right, which is on your left, here's your ureter, and then it drains into the urinary bladder right here. Okay, and so these ureters drain into the urinary bladder right there. And then here's your urinary bladder, and your urethra is right there. When they insert a Foley catheter, so when you need to be catheterized to get the bladder to drain, they're going to insert the catheter up the urethra, and then there's a little balloon that keeps it nestled in the urinary bladder so that the urine can drain out of the catheter. And before you remove the catheter, you have to deflate the balloon as well. So that's a little interesting fact. If we take a cross section of the ureter, notice the ureter has connective tissue on the outside, right? But it also has smooth muscle for contraction, for peristalsis, and then it has more connective tissue, and then it has transitional epithelium. So on that internal layer, if we zoom in a little bit, and that internal layer is, transitional epithelium, all right? And we know that epithelium lines, and when it's many layers deep, it's for protection. So this stuff can slough off, and it sloughs off in your urine, just like in the urinary bladder. The innermost lining is transitional epithelium as well, and the epithelia will be shed. And you can actually see these. If you look under a microscope at urine, you can see casts of epithelium. They kind of like look like swirls. They look like little filaments of epithelial cells, like strands of epithelial cells, because urine drains through the urinary bladder, kind of like how water drains out of a drain, and it drains down and it takes the stuff with it. So you can find casts in there, sometimes bacteria, hopefully not too many bacteria. Sometimes you can find crystals that have precipitated in the bladder. It's really interesting. Okay, so take a look at the urinary bladder. Again, connective tissue, right? Smooth muscle. That smooth muscle is going to be stretchable or distendable. So we talked about skeletal muscle last semester, and we covered cardiac this semester. Smooth muscle is another one. This can stretch a lot, you guys. Your urinary bladder can become increase in volume extensively. And so there's a urinary bladder and then the urethra. Notice that there's a sphincter, okay? And so there's a sphincter right here, an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. And when you have a catheter, these sphincters don't constrict. And so when you pull the catheter out, you have to retrain these sphincters to constrict. You can read that. Males, the urethra is actually combined with uro and genital system. So the urethra is really long. They have a prosthetic urethra for men, membranous urethra, and then a penile or spongy urethra. And so ejaculate and urine come out of the urethra. In females, it's separate. We have separate reproductive and urinary systems. We have a short urethra, or women have a short urethra. And let's take a look at the pictures. So orientate yourself. Here is the ureter. Here is the urinary bladder, right? And then the urinary bladder is going to drain out through the urethra, and the male's urethra is really long, right? Take a look at the urethra. Right surrounding that urethra is a prostate gland. And so you can see the prostate gland is about the size of a walnut. So you can see that as men age and the prostate gland gets swollen or inflamed or irritated, that it constricts the urethra. And then men have a hard time urinating through that prostate gland. Prostate cancer, the onset of prostate cancer is around age 55 for men. So that's something that you want to be aware of. I think at age 40, they monitor the size of the prostate. The other portions of this, notice how for the reproductive tract, and we'll talk about that next week, here's your testes, and then the epididymis and the vas deferens. Look at the vas deferens looping around. And then it goes behind the urinary bladder. There's a seminal vesicle. There's an ejaculatory duct. And then it connects to the urethra. And so this is a shared tube, if you will, right? And it's really interesting that you can let urine go through here, and the urine is slightly acidic, and that acidic urine will actually kill sperm. And so before a man ejaculates, the bulbal urethral gland is going to, right there, is going to release a neutral pH solution that increases the pH to pH 7. So that sort of neutralizes the urine so that the sperm can flow through the tube and not die. Okay, for females, it's a little bit different. Here's a urinary bladder, right? So, and you can't see the urethra because it's coming out at you. So urethra, and then the urinary bladder, and here's the urethra, or excuse me, the ureters, you guys, the urinary bladder, and then the urethra. Look at how short that urethra is compared to the men's urethra. And notice that the urethra is right here, and then we have the vagina leading to the uterus, and then the anus. And so it's more common for women to get urinary tract infections because the urethra is so close to the vagina and the anus. And if they're not wiping properly, or if they're bedbound, or if they, have diarrhea or what have you, it's easy to get E. coli into the urinary bladder. And once it's in the bladder, it can migrate its way up through the ureters up to the kidney and cause a kidney infection or a blood infection. Another thing too is, notice here's your pubic symphysis, right? So here's your pubic bone. The bladder and then the uterus is right behind that. And so when a woman is pregnant, the uterus grows, right, and smacks that urinary bladder right against that pubic symphysis. And so that's the urgency to pee or urinate. Nephron, functionally into the kidney. There's approximately 1 million nephrons per kidney. They're found mostly in the renal cortex. The lingo that we're looking for is the renal corpuscle, is the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule. And then we have tubules from that. So we have a proximal convoluted tubule, a distal convoluted tubule, and then a loop of Henle. And then we have a collecting duct, and the collecting duct drains many nephrons. This actually shows the vascularization of it. So here's your renal artery, and notice the renal artery turns into interlobular artery, which is between the lobes, right? So interlobular artery, then the arcuate artery, which wraps around the pyramid, and then the interlobular artery. And so off of each one of these are thousands of nephrons. And so each kidney has 1 million nephrons. And so these kidneys are really, really vascular. If you blow this up, take a look at your blood flow. So here's your arcuate artery, right? That's wrapping around the pyramid. And then you have your interlobular artery. But take a look. You have an afferent arteriole, a branch off of that goes into the glomerulus. The glomerulus is the fancy name for your capillary bed. So afferent arteriole, glomerulus, or capillary bed, and then efferent arteriole. And take a look at that efferent arteriole and how it wraps around the rest of the nephron. And this is the vasa recta. And then it comes back to the arcuate vein and ultimately to the renal vein, and then dumps into the vena cava. So the goal of filtration, or the goal of this nephron, is to filter out wastes and reabsorb nutrients. Okay. This is a busy slide. You can look at it in more detail. This just shows you the different nephrons. So here is a cortical nephron. Take a look at how short the loop of Henle is compared to the juxtamedullary nephron. Okay. And so here are your paratubular capillaries that are wrapped around the nephron. Because remember, the capillary bed wraps around the nephron to get maximum reabsorption of nutrients back into the bloodstream. And then here's your vasa recta for that one. Here's a little bit of microscopic histology. So just to give you an orientation, all these circles are actually glomeruli. And so it's really crazy how densely packed these are. And so this is labeled for you. Here is your afferent arterial, right? So afferent arterial, glomerulus, and efferent arterial. Notice the efferent arterial is smaller than the afferent, and so blood is going to flow into the capillary bed really effectively, and then there's going to be a buildup of pressure because this efferent arterial is smaller. And so you're going to get a pressure buildup. And so when we build up pressure, what do we get more of? Do we get more of filtration or reabsorption? Okay, we get more of filtration. And so we're going to get more filtration of stuff through that nephron. And this is just showing the blood vessels. This is not showing the rest of the nephron. So it's just showing the glomerulus, which is a capillary bed. Okay, so strip away everything else. The functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. So let's take a look at the nephron. So here, and you should draw this out, you guys. Here is your efferent arterial. I'm sorry, you guys. Afferent arterial, glomerulus, it's a capillary bed, and then efferent arterial, right? Afferent arterial is going to the glomerulus. Efferent arterial is exiting the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is a capillary bed. What is surrounding that glomerulus? The tissue or the part of the nephron that surrounds it is called the Bowman's capsule. Together, the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus make the renal corpuscle. So in case you're wondering where that came in, it's right there. The segment that comes next is your proximal convoluted tubule. So proximal convoluted tubule. And then your loop of Henle. So going down is called your descending limb of your loop of Henle. And then going up is called your ascending limb of your loop of Henle. And then your distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule connects to the collecting duct. And so the collecting duct, there are many nephrons that merge to one collecting duct. And then the collecting duct is going to drain urine into the renal, the papillae and the calyx, the calyces, and then the ultimately urinary bladder and out the body. So what happens? The short version is blood comes into the afferent arterial, goes through the glomerulus, and nutrients and waste get filtered out, and then blood goes back through, and as the urine is going through these tubes, stuff gets pulled back into the bloodstream. Nutrients do, and then whatever's left, whatever waste product is left, gets kicked out to the bladder. Here's a better picture. So the glomerulus, what's the job of the glomerulus? To do filtration, right? So the glomerulus does the filtration. It filters almost everything out, right? Except for large molecules like your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets, and your albumins. And so everything else is filtered out. So when I say everything else, would glucose be filtered out? Yes. Would sodium ions be filtered out? Yes. Would bicarbonate? Yeah, it would. What about CO2, oxygen? Yes. Okay. Amino acids, they would too. Okay, so you get the picture. So all the small things or small guys get filtered out. As they go through the tubes, those nutrients get reabsorbed. So this is kind of like a big strainer. So you think of a big strainer and you're straining a pot of spaghetti, right? You're draining it. So you're dumping the spaghetti in the water in the strainer, and the water is dripping through, but the spaghetti stays stuck. So the spaghetti would be like the red blood cells, and everything else is draining through. And then that leftover water, whatever nutrients you need out of that leftover water or that urine, is going to get reabsorbed. So you're dumping everything out, dumping out all the nutrients. Kind of weird, right? And then as the nutrients are flowing through the tube, or as the pre-urine is flowing through the tube, you're reabsorbing nutrients back into the bloodstream as you need them, depending on what region you're at, right? So you reabsorb different nutrients at different regions. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And then you also secrete stuff. So you're going to secrete waste like creatinine or urea into the urine as well, okay? And then whatever's left is going to go to the bladder and get kicked out in the urine. All right, so kidney function, let's see. So, excuse me, the Bowman's capsule, the volume of fluid that goes through that Bowman's capsule is 180 liters per day. So that gives you an idea of how much fluid is flowing through that Bowman's capsule. And then at the end of the proximal convoluted tubule, there's 54 liters per day. So you reabsorb a lot of fluid, about 120 liters in the proximal tubule. So you do a lot of reabsorption of water in that proximal convoluted tubule. Then you do more in the loop of Henle. So by the time you're at the end of the loop of Henle, you only have 18 liters passing through that part per day. And then at the end of the collecting duct is 1.5 liters per day. I like this chart because it shows you how much fluid goes through each space. And so Bowman's capsule is doing doing filtration, and so it's going to see the most fluid. And then at the end of each segment, you see how much fluid is reabsorbed. Take a look at the osmolarity. So the Bowman's capsule, the osmolarity of that fluid is 300 milliosmoles. That is analogous to your blood plasma. So that's around 0.9%. The end of the proximal convoluted tubule, same thing. Loop of Henle, once we get to the end of the loop of Henle, it's a little bit more dilute. And then at the collecting duct, depending on how hydrated or dehydrated you are, you're going to pull in water or not pull in water. And so that is going to be a range of concentrations depending on how hydrated or dehydrated you are. Excuse me. If we assume the plasma volume entering the afferent arteriole is 100%, 20% of that is filtered, and 80% goes back into normal circulation. Now you may think, well, 20% isn't that great, right? But think about if you have 1 million nephrons and each of them are doing 20% of the blood filtering, that's a lot of filtration. So it's a really effective system. Out of that 20% that's filtered, 19% of that gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. And then you kick out about 1% of urine is excreted. So 99% of that plasma, entering the kidney returns to systemic circulation. 1% gets lost as urine. If we zoom into the renal corpuscle, and again, this would be your glomerulus. So on the left-hand side is your glomerulus, right? And then these are endothelial cells. And then there's a little bit of space. That's a basal lamina. And then you have these podocytes. These are actually foot processes of podocytes, which are foot cells, kind of weird, right? But they wrap around the glomerulus. And then you have the space that is the lumen of the Bowman's capsule. And so stuff is going to get filtered out through the capillary into the Bowman's capsule. What gets filtered out at the glomerulus? Water is a really good one, guys. Water gets filtered out. Glucose gets filtered out. Ions and electrolytes, right? Your sodium, your chloride, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. Amino acids, bicarbonate, protons, and waste like creatinine and urea. What stays in the glomerulus? So what doesn't get filtered out of the glomerulus? Think of your large proteins and your large molecules, like your red blood cells or your large cells, right? White blood cells, your platelets, your albumins, your large hormones, right? Good. Factors governing filtration rate at the capillary bed. So net filtration pressure, Total membrane surface area available for filtration, which is under regulation of sympathetic nervous system, and then your membrane permeability, like your surface area of your glomerulus, right? And this is regulated by the podocytes. The one that we're really interested in is your net filtration pressure. So let's take a look at that. So net filtration pressure is dependent on three pressures, and this is almost identical to your capillary. So if you didn't learn the capillary when we covered blood pressure, the capillary filtration and reabsorption, it's going to come back to haunt you. So, excuse me. Here's your afferent arterial. So blood is flowing through your afferent arterial, right? And that pressure is kicking fluid out into the Bowman's capsule. So here's your glomerulus, here's your Bowman's capsule, right? So the pressure that's forcing fluid out would be what pressure? Okay, so if you look at the purple line, it says glomerular pressure or hydrostatic pressure, right? So we can say this is hydrostatic pressure forcing fluid out, and that's about 55 millimeters of mercury. We can actually say this is MAP too, so that should look familiar to you guys. It's identical to your circulatory system because it is a capillary bed. It is your circulatory system. Hydrostatic pressure is forcing fluid out. Then you have two opposing pressures. When that fluid hits the Bowman's capsule, you bounce back. And so that bounce back pressure is called your capsular hydrostatic pressure. So that's your green line, or your green area, capsular hydrostatic pressure, right? And that's 15 millimeters of mercury. But then take a look at the orange line. This one should look familiar to you too. Blood colloid osmotic pressure. So blood colloid osmotic pressure is osmotic pressure, and osmotic pressure is pulling fluid back in. What is osmotic pressure based off of? It's based off of the albumins in the blood or in the capillary bed, right? So here's your capillary bed, and you have albumins in there. And because you have albumins in that space and not in this space, water's going to want to go where the albumins are. And so osmotic pressure pulls fluid back in, so it recalls fluid. So hydrostatic pressure is forcing fluid out, osmotic pressure is pulling fluid back into the glomerulus. And so you're going to add up those pressures. So this is 55 millimeters of mercury going outwards. This is 10 and, excuse me, this is 15 and 30 going back. And so we have a net filtration pressure of 10. And so this is small, okay? And it's not a lot of filtration pressure, but it's enough to get filtration to occur. And so you want filtration to occur because you want to get rid of the wastes. If somebody's blood pressure drops, then they do not do this and they're considered to be in kidney failure. And so you have to have dialysis. You have to have a machine take over filtration because the kidney can't work right now. Glomerular filtration rate is a measurement of functional capacity of the kidney. It depends on the differences in pressures between the capillaries and the Bowman space. The net filtration pressure, which we just talked about, is going to drive glomerular filtration rate. So the idea behind this is that if you have a high pressure, you're going to have a high filtration rate, right? Which should make sense. So if blood pressure is high, if you look at the picture, here's your afferent arterial, here's your glomerulus, here's your efferent arterial, right? So if blood pressure is high, you're going to be forcing fluid through or forcing filtration to occur really fast, right? And so high pressure, you get a lot of filtration. So high hydrostatic pressure or high MAP, you get a lot of glomerular filtration. The goal of your kidney is to regulate glomerular filtration rate, or how fast fluid moves out of the glomerulus, to keep it constant, right? This is constant, even though your blood pressure is changing a lot. So here's MAP, here's your mean arterial blood pressure. Your mean arterial blood pressure, here's 80. 120, and then 160, right? So even though you're sleeping at night, you're out exercising, you have somewhat high blood pressure, your glomerular filtration rate is constant, okay? So even though your MAP flexes, glomerular filtration rate is constant. And so this is one of the things that your kidney does. Notice that if MAP is really high, so let's say you have really high blood pressure, glomerular filtration rate is going to go up. And so you're going to lose fluid because blood pressure is high. Look at the other side too. If MAP drops, remember, if MAP drops below 55 millimeters of mercury, you're not going to get any filtration. And so you're going to be considered in kidney failure. The goal is to keep glomerular filtration rate constant. Why? Okay, so if your glomerular filtration rate is too high, then urine's going to flow through the tubes too fast and you're not going to pull in what you need. If glomerular filtration rate is too low, then everything's going to go through the tubes really slowly and you're going to pull in wastes, and normally you kick out wastes. So if you look at the picture, if filtration is going too fast, then urine's going too fast through the tubes, right? And you can't reabsorb nutrients. If filtration rate is too slow, then you're going to reabsorb nutrients, but you're also going to reabsorb waste that you're trying to get rid of. So you want to keep this constant. So regardless if you're running or sleeping at night, glomerular filtration rate is constant. How do we do it? We do it many different ways, you guys. Myogenic response, that's one of them. This is similar to autoregulation in your systemic arterials. So when blood pressure goes up, your smooth muscle constricts and slows it down. If blood pressure drops, then your vessels are going to dilate. Then there's a tubuloglomerular feedback mechanism and hormones and autonomic neurons. Okay. So we're going to stop there, and I'm going to pick this up next lecture. Okay. Thank you.